Good morning, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do another installment in my series on the King James Bible. We're following this book. It's called In the Beginning. It's the story of the King James Bible, and by Alistair McGrath. But of course, I'm interjecting with a lot of information that I know myself in my head, and also I'm referring to other books which will be very interesting. Eventually, we're going to be looking at my book, which I wrote quite a long time ago, which is a book talking about and commenting on the preface to the King James Version, and also the preface to the Revised Version, and also to the New International Version. All of these prefaces are written by the translators or by the revisers, and they're very interesting indeed, and they do help us to understand what was going on in the minds of those that were translators. Now today we're continuing what we picked up earlier, which was the Reformation, and we're going to talk this time about the English Reformation and Henry VIII. Now, in any event, it may be said to have prepared the ground for the translation of the Bible into English. It was the Reformation in England. So this was the transformation in culture and in thinking and in religion and in belief and in the structure of the English church, which began under Henry VIII. Now, the details of this story are sometimes a little involved. I'm sorry if that's a problem. And how he came to the English throne in 1509, and how he set himself an agenda for making the realm of England a significant European power. Now, the Henry VIII's concern was to ensure a smooth transition of power after his death, through producing a son and heir to the English throne. Now, that sentence is sufficient to understand Henry's life and motives. He was always concerned about how there would be a smooth transition between himself and the next heir to the throne. Now, his marriage to the Spanish Catherine of Aragon had produced a daughter. It had produced a future queen, Mary Tudor. The marriage had not only failed to produce the required son and heir, but it also reflected the political realities of an earlier generation, which saw an alliance between England and Spain as essential to sound foreign policy. The weakness of this assumption had become clear by 1525, when Charles V declined to marry Henry's daughter by Catherine. Therefore, it began the process by which he would have to divorce Catherine. Under normal circumstances, this procedure would not have been expected to encounter any difficulties whatsoever. An appeal to the Pope to annul the marriage would normally have secured the desired result without any difficulty. See, popes generally were open to granting all sorts of favours to the king, and they were quite willing to do that, because they knew that in turn they could ask for a favour themselves. However, this was not normal times. And at this time, the city of Rome was under virtual siege by the army of the Emperor Charles V, and the Pope, Clement VII, was feeling somewhat threatened as a result. And Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, and Clement could hardly wish to offend Charles V at such a sensitive moment by allowing Henry to divorce one of Charles's relatives. Now, as a result, the request for the divorce failed. And as if to add insult to injury, Clement VII informed Henry that he would be excommunicated if he married again, because in Roman thinking, that would be considered to be adultery. They didn't believe that a divorce was ever possible. So Henry VIII was less than happy, shall we say, about this decision. And he set about a program of persuasion, at both national and international levels. And he wanted the independence of England as a separate province of the church. He wanted autonomy for himself as the English king. Henry wanted to break free from the power of the Pope by being able to take control of the affairs of the English church himself. And on November the 3rd, 1529, Henry convened a parliament with the intention of reducing the power of both church and clergy in England. Now then, the English clergy initially refused to concede to his points, fearing erosion of their influence and status. That prompted Henry to bring in very severe measures to help the English clergy realize the errors of their ways. The most important of these took place over the period of 1530 to 31, during which Henry argued that the English clergy, by virtue of their support of Rome, were guilty of praemunire. Now, this was a technical offence, thought to be a form of treason, in that it involved allegiance to a foreign power, which was, of course, the Pope. And faced with this threat, which incidentally could include the death penalty, the clergy reluctantly agreed to at least some of Henry's demands for recognition of his ecclesiastical authority, in relation to the church. And Henry knew perfectly well that the threat of a traitor's death would definitely help his clergy cope with their theological difficulties. Henry was presented with an opportunity for the further advance of his aims in August 1532, when the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, conveniently died, and Henry replaced him with Thomas Cranmer, who had earlier indicated his strong support for Henry's divorce proceedings. So Cranmer was finally consecrated archbishop, possibly against his will, on March the 30th in 1533, and meanwhile Henry had begun an affair with Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn became pregnant in December of 1532. The pregnancy raised all kinds of legal niceties. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was annulled by an English court in May 1533, allowing Anne to be crowned queen on June the 1st. Her daughter Elizabeth Tudor, the future Queen Elizabeth I, was born on September the 7th of the following year. Henry's divorce to Catherine immediately led to the threat of excommunication by the Church of Rome. Henry now determined to follow through the course of action which he had already embarked upon, but with his supreme political and religious authority within England, and how it would be recognised. A series of acts of Parliament were imposed in 1534. Among them was the Succession Act, which declared that the crown would pass to Henry's children. There was a particular device to recognise how that would happen. The Supremacy Act declared that Henry was to be recognised as the supreme head over the Church of England, in name only, of course. He was not a religious man in any way, but he would act as it were, chairman of the board. That's the point. And then there was the Treasons Act, which made denial of Henry's supremacy an act of treason punishable by death. This final act led to the execution of two prominent Catholic churchmen, Thomas More and John Fisher, both of whom refused to recognize Henry as supreme head of the English Church, a title they believed which belonged only to the Pope. Now, Henry now found himself under threat of invasion from neighbouring Catholic states. You see, the popes controlled the politics of Europe in such a way that if anybody fell out of favour with them, they would immediately send a command to neighbouring states to invade, and that was a great problem. So the measures that he reached in 1534, Henry ordered many English monasteries to be closed. Now, He made an investigation initially into the English monasteries and found that they were full of all sorts of very, very dubious practices. There were men living with men in large buildings, and there were women living with women in the nunneries. And this was leading to all sorts of extreme sexual and relationship practices. It was a monopoly, and it was an exceptionally bad thing in the time. So after the investigation, certain monasteries that were found to be not good places to be were pulled down. And now we cannot go without noticing that Henry came into possession of a lot of lands. He also became in possession of a lot of goods. Some of these monasteries were exceptionally wealthy beyond belief. Now, Henry didn't go around executing the monks or the abbots or the abbesses. What he did was he would pension them off. He'd give them a pension for the rest of their life, but they were not allowed to continue in the way that they had done before. And this brought about what's called the dissolution of the monasteries. And this brought to Henry a lot of wealth and a lot of land and a lot of peasants. And the effect of that was that he had funds to enable him to strengthen himself against foreign invasion. And of course, Elizabeth I would be the one that would eventually be faced with the great Spanish invasion. Now, it soon became obvious that the theological enthusiasm for Lutheranism was little more than a temporary political manoeuvring on the part of Henry. And Henry's chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, unwisely, Cromwell tried to force Henry into a closer alliance with Lutheranism by persuading him to marry Anne of Cleves. Cromwell arranged for Hans Holbein to paint an excessively flattering portrait of this Lutheran princess. But Henry never met her before the marriage, and on seeing her in the flesh, his enthusiasm paled into insignificance, and he divorced Anne as soon as it was convenient to do so, and had Cromwell executed. It was not a good thing. When it became clear that there was serious opposition with England to his reform measures, Henry backtracked, and in 1543, in what is called the King's Book, shows every evidence of Henry's desire to avoid giving offence to Catholics. By the time of Henry's death in January 1547, the religious situation in England was somewhat ambivalent. Although Henry had made many concessions to Lutheranism, his own preference appears to have been Roman Catholic, and he died basically a Roman Catholic. He basically died that way. A lot of the traditional Catholic beliefs and practices, which at one stage were refused, were then reinstated. You see, two or 3 years earlier, he tried to close down the chantries. Now, some of you may not know what a chantry is, but a chantry was a place built for the chanting for the souls of the dead and prayers for the dead. And this also brought in a great wealth for the Roman Church. Henry saw that as a bad thing and tried to shut them down, but then a few years later, he was building them back up again. So you can see that he was a man who wavered in many things. Henry's agenda was always political. He was a deeply religious person, but he was nevertheless a politician more than anything else. Now, in the end, the English Reformation had to be recognized as an act of the state in comparison to the situation in Germany, in which Luther's Reformation was certainly a revival of Christian truth. Okay, quite a different thing. It was a theological platform. And then let me read this last little paragraph in this chapter. It says, in the event Henry's hand was forced in the matter of Bible translation, suddenly, without advance warning, a well-produced printed English translation of the New Testament began to circulate in England in the early 1520s. 26, it caused a crisis. The church authorities immediately set in place measures to block the importation of these Bibles and to destroy every copy that arrived in England. They knew that if they could stop this translation in its tracks, they would have only one option at their disposal, and that is that they would have to produce a translation for themselves. And thus it outperformed, and they had to make sure that whatever happened about this new translation, it would have to outperform and outsell all its rivals. Now we'll talk next time about what translation that was. I have a copy here of that translation. It's not in the format of the original, but it is a translation of the original, and it is an excellent version. Suffice to say that it was well produced, it was small, it had had the benefit of many years of revision. So all the little idiosyncrasies of printing, the little typos, have been removed. It also was a true study Bible. It had lots of extensive notes. It had lots of cross-referencing, and it had lots of helps in the back. It was a Bible's Bible. It was exceptionally good. And all the Christians in England at the time would have loved it, because it just was exceptionally biblical in its outlook. And we'll talk about that next time. So have a great day. We look forward to catching up with you on our next episode. Bye for now.